You're listening to Mistreated. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. The following conversation is about forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. On this podcast, we try to give additional context to the topics we discuss, and this conversation requires a longer look at the history and how we got here. But we think it's important. Please listen with care. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, was meant to bring a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of residential schools and, by extension, Canadian colonialism. Led by the late Honourable Murray Sinclair, a former First Nation lawyer, judge, and senator, the Commission's main project was to document the experiences of residential school survivors, families, and communities, and to promote reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people in Canada. One of the calls to action from the TRC was for Canada to hold a national inquiry into the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That inquiry dealt with a wide range of concerns, including forced and coerced sterilizations. After listening to testimony and reviewing the research, the national inquiry explained the root of the issue. In the eyes of the colonizer, the long-standing, misguided, and racist view of First Nations and Métis women as promiscuous, unchristian, and uncivilized justified the policy of eugenics. Indeed, sterilization was viewed as a way to eventually eliminate the Indigenous population entirely. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it a serious human rights violation. Several class actions have been filed on behalf of Indigenous women and girls who were impacted by sterilizations, framed as medically necessary. The cases date from the 1970s right up to the present. The 94 calls to action offered by the TRC made important recommendations in relation to improving the provision of healthcare for Indigenous peoples in a culturally sensitive way, including concrete changes to the education system for social workers and doctors. It also recommended hiring more Indigenous healthcare professionals. A number of the 231 calls for justice in the national inquiry also called for a recognition of Indigenous peoples' human rights in healthcare and for a system of accountability for healthcare providers. The practice of forced sterilizations has been condemned internationally as well. Prior to the national inquiry, a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture confirmed that forced sterilization is an act of violence and a form of social control, and violates a person's right to be free from torture and ill treatment. The rapporteur also called for countries to prohibit forced and coerced sterilizations. Senator Yvonne Boyer heard that call and brought a bill forward in 2025, Bill S-228. If passed, this amendment would ensure that forced sterilization would be included in the Criminal Code of Canada. It would be considered aggravated assault, punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Today, we're speaking with Harmony Red Sky from the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice. We talk about the history of forced and coerced sterilization, the organization's survivor-led initiatives, and the push for legislative change to criminalize these violations. Please listen with care. Harmony Red Sky joins me now. Could you please introduce yourself?
Bonjour, now Gijagokwe Dishnakaz Megizian Dodem, Wasaxin Donjaba, Bodawadami, Minwa, Honashoni, Nishnabé Koyandao. My name's Harmony Red Sky. I just introduced myself in Anishinaabe Moin as Center of the Sky Women, Eagle Clan from Wasaxin First Nation.
Harmony Red Sky, welcome to the podcast. We're here to talk about something that's really difficult to talk about, but something that's important to acknowledge and to look at the history of that. Before we start talking about that, I wanted to spend time first talking about your organization and what it does. What is the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice?
So the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice is a national not-for-profit organization that was formed as a result of the long and important work that was created by Senator Yvonne Boyer. Once Senator Yvonne Boyer brought the issue to the Senate of Canada, there were a number of studies and reports that were carried out, and the Senate is the place where the bill, which is now Bill S-228, was formed and developed. And those two reports that are about forced and coerced sterilization provided many recommendations around how Canada needed to act in response to this crime, this ongoing issue that is still persistent in Canada. And so that's where the Survivor Circle for Reproductive Justice was born. As part of the response to the reports at the time in 2022, the government responded with immediate direct healing supports for survivors. And so the organization specifically mandated to address the issues of forced and coerced sterilization was born. And so we launched in 2024, the fall of 2024. And since then, which is less than 2 years, really, since then we have formed a national registry, a national archive, and outreach to find survivors located across Canada, in all parts of Canada that are First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, that are female, that are male, that are Two-Spirit LGBTQ+. And as well, we have formed a healing support fund that has funded not only individual personal healing, but group community healing activities, as well as assisted reproductive technology.
You mentioned Senator Boyer. I want to come back to her, and I also want to come back to the bill. But before we talk more about that, you have 3 pillars that guide the work that you do with the Survivors Circle. Can you tell us about those?
So we have a focus very much so on centering survivors in all of the work that we do. So we are survivor-directed, survivor-led. The membership of the registry are the owners of the organization. So we're set up in a way that they vote, they decide annually what the direction will be for the organization.
Why is that?
Because it is meant for them. You know, the intention behind the creation of the organization, as well as the healing support funds. So every step of the way, from the time we developed the organization until now, survivors have been right there in the development of how the registry would be formed. You know, what would the registry contain? What is important to keep in a national archive? What should the criteria be around the healing support fund? What streams? What should we fund? All of those questions, we've gone to them and we've asked them, and they've told us. So it's been designed specifically to meet the needs of survivors.
So this registry will serve to keep a record, as you say, of Indigenous people who have been sterilized without consent. I think some people listening might be surprised to hear that this happened in the first place. How far back does this history go? And is this something that's still happening here in this country?
Right. So the history of forced and coerced sterilization in Canadian institutions and in the realm of colonization dates back to the 1880s. So the residential school era, and it was part of the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, did identify that sterilizations, as well as medical experiments, nutritional experiments, were undertaken on the children in residential schools. So
that's how the Canadian Food Guide was developed, right?
Yes. So that's how the Canadian Food Guide was developed. So that is the first instance of it. From there, it emerged into eugenics policies that were in place in various provinces here in Canada. It does have a long history, and it still continues today. So right now, what is a typical pregnancy, childbirth, and labor for an Indigenous woman might mean that she has to leave her home community, travel sometimes thousands of kilometers to the nearest hospital to deliver her baby, and oftentimes can't have her family with her, traveling with her. And in those instances, that's when women might be the most vulnerable. And that's when some of the sterilizations that we have documented and have recorded in the registry have occurred, is when women are vulnerable, they're by themselves, their families aren't with them as support people or to be able to be there, or a navigator or a language interpreter isn't there. And it's in those situations where misunderstanding around the documentation being provided, other barriers, and sometimes not even being asked at all, where sterilizations have occurred. So very much a present day issue.
Do we know how many people have been sterilized without consent?
Right now, the estimates are somewhere between 12 and 15,000. But what we find is happening every day when we talk about the issue in new places and regions in the country is once people hear the words and start to put together these concepts with what has happened to them in their previous experiences of the healthcare system, more and more women are self-identifying as being survivors themselves. So the number might be far greater than what has been estimated.
That's heartbreaking. So when it happens, some people are not even aware that this is something that happened to them.
Well, that is just the legacy of, genocide, right, against Indigenous people, where not only have they faced multiple barriers, having been survivors of residential school or 60s scoop or all of the other things that have been a daily occurrence. It's that whole issue of walking into worlds of going into the healthcare system to see a doctor, what might be an emergency, what might be a routine procedure, and having a completely different outcome than what was anticipated or expected. So just by nature, any Indigenous person trusting the healthcare system with their healthcare, that there are issues there, real issues. We know Joyce Echaquan and the story that has happened there. There are other examples of it in Canada, and many survivors who we are working with now who have come forward in the public about what happened to them with this doctor in that hospital, in that city, in that province. And there will be more. There are so many situations where it has happened. And our most recent survivor registered in the registry was sterilized in 2024. So it's very, very common still. There are situations where women were about to give birth or were going into labor in Canada in 2025, where sterilizations were prevented because they knew about the Survivor Circle for Reproductive Justice, and they knew that they had rights, and they knew that it was their choice. And so that's part of the public education work we need to do to ensure that everybody has the choice and the right to decide on what will happen to their bodies.
So even though this is a difficult conversation to have, it's a necessary one. Can you help us understand something? What's the difference between coerced and forced sterilization?
So forced sterilization, an example of that would be you are not given any choice. It just happens. There are situations where people have been sedated and under anesthesia, where they wake up and it has happened, or they have been very physically forced into it by being held down with restraints, by being held against their will. So there are examples of that kind of forced. Coerced happens in many different ways, and we've actually started to measure and track the various ways in which it happens. Some of the most common ways would be through the child welfare system. So right now, if a woman is delivering and has had children already, the doctor might say, oh, well, you've already had 3 kids, or you've already had, or you probably can't afford to have more, and placed a judgment as well as a criticism on the individual to make her feel bad or feel guilty, or to question, maybe I don't need any more kids, right there on the spot. So that would be an example of how coercion has occurred.
You're not even in the, because when you've had a baby, there's so many things happening, emotions, hormones, and to have that conversation, the timing feels a little.
Yeah. So that would be an example in child welfare. It's happened in other ways where particular communities or regions may be more religious, and in some instances it's been, if you don't do this now, you're not going to survive. You're going to go to hell. All kinds of different judgments and types of coercion. You won't be able to get a job. You won't be able to provide. All types of racist, very, very racist comments have been made. We document this in the testimonies of survivors who are in the registry. And for them, it's about justice and for having their story counted and being included in an official record of what has happened, what has been done. And in some instances, it's been so barbaric. It's unbelievable that anybody could be treated this way. And so that's why it's important for us to look at the ways in which coercion happens. And I think right now we've counted at least seven different ways that are common patterns and behaviors that we're seeing in the registry.
Because ultimately what ends up happening is when you have a procedure like this, you can't reverse it. And it's not just impacting the individual. This is something that has lasting impacts on their family, on their community, their future generations. So what are some of those impacts when this kind of procedure happens in those communities?
Well, very much one of the things that is central to most Indigenous nations, most Indigenous communities, is in the teachings that we have around women and the rites of passage in becoming a woman or being a woman in community, is that ability to reproduce, that ability to create, to have those waters to birth a child, is one of the greatest gifts that we're given in creation, in our teachings. And so we place that role, motherhood, pregnancy, birthing, as being huge, like very, very sacred, very, very important, and it's central. And so what that means when that's taken, and this has been something that we have worked and supported survivors around, especially now that we're doing the work around fertility and assisted reproductive technology, is really supporting those women who have had that gift taken from them to find justice in other ways, or to find those roles and that restorative justice in other ways. And one of the ways in which it happens is to become teachers by telling their story, by supporting that body autonomy in young women and young boys, and really becoming teachers in their communities as aunties, sometimes adopted kukums or grannies in their communities in different ways, but it has a huge effect. We've heard of communities, some communities where there are generations that have been wiped out because of perhaps a medical experiment or sterilization that occurred amongst a group or an age of children in residential school, where there is a generation that is completely removed, where from there none of those people were able to go on and have kids. So there are examples of that here in Canada. Other examples are that, there are many survivors in our registry that never had children at all. And so supporting the healing in that, and with many survivors, they didn't know. They didn't know this is what happened to them as a child or as a teenager or after the birth of their first child, or whatever the situation might be, where they didn't know. They went on to try to have more children or to have kids only to find out that they're not getting anywhere, it's not working, only to go in and get tested and then find out that way when the testing results come back to say, actually, you were sterilized. Did you not know that? Right. And so that's a very common way in which survivors find out that they were sterilized.
How do you process something like that?
It's tragic. It's horrible. And so that's one of the things that we do is support individuals who are coming to terms with what happened to them by providing healing supports and mental health services to be able to help them kind of reconcile or even address the trauma that they've been through.
So when we look towards justice and accountability, you mentioned Bill S-228. What is that?
So Bill S-228 is a bill that was developed by Senator Yvonne Boyer as the issue became front and central in the Senate of Canada. And so originally it was Bill S-250, and it was an act to amend the criminal code. And so it has been developed since that time. It is now Bill S-228. It is currently in the House of Commons at between second reading and third reading stage. And the bill is really focused on criminalizing forced and coerced sterilization. It is really focused on protecting the patient's rights and the ability to choose and decide with informed, valid consent how they would like, what healthcare services and what healthcare they choose to receive.
There's been a lot of support for this bill, and I want to talk about that, and also some pushback towards it. But I want to talk more about Senator Boyer. How did she become involved with this, and why did it matter to her?
Originally, the issue became front and central in 2015 when two survivors in Saskatchewan came forward to the media. They came forward to the media and said that they had both been sterilized in a Saskatoon hospital. And once that hit the news, that health authority for that region immediately responded by calling for an external review. At that point, Senator Yvonne Boyer, who was a practicing lawyer, was called in, and from there she formed a team to conduct that review with her. When they did the review, hundreds of women came forward and said that had happened to them. And so from there, that was 2015. From there, she went on to be appointed to the Senate. From there, she brought the issue to the Senate of Canada, and then from there developed Bill S-250, which is now Bill S-228, and has really been a champion, has now put in years of working and meeting with survivors from across the country to support and give them voice and to support justice, not just for those survivors, but for the prevention of forced and coerced sterilization in the future by bringing this bill forward.
11 years, that's a long time. The Canadian Medical Association supports the bill, the amendment, and says that it's, quote, a critical step in forced sterilizations being, quote, unequivocally recognized as criminal acts. But the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has written an op-ed saying that the bill would have unintended consequences. I'm going to read this quote. It's long, so I'll break it up into separate parts. The first part of the op-ed reads, a law intended to protect women could inadvertently contribute to a more restrictive and risk-adverse environment in the delivery of reproductive care. What's your response to that?
The bill really centers and focuses justice and the issue of informed and valid consent for survivors. So the bill is focused on the patient's ability to choose, and it is not intended to be a deterrent or to prevent doctors from doing their duty of care in any way, shape, or form. And so the way we have heard it from some of the experts that we work with who are OBGYNs who are practicing across the country is that if they are doing their job properly, there's nothing to worry about. There's no need to worry about the bill because if you're doing your due diligence, if you're providing the best care that you can, then you don't have to worry at all. There is a section in the criminal code already that protects doctors who have to undertake life-saving procedures in an emergency situation. Doctors will continue to be protected and safe under that. And we don't have any survivors in our registry right now that were sterilized under a life-saving emergency. So like that just goes to show you it is the contrast between what is a forced and coerced sterilization versus a life-saving emergency is night and day. It's quite obvious the difference between the two. And if a doctor is doing their job by providing the best care that they can and speaking to the patient and forming a relationship with the patient and has obtained consent that is ongoing even after the procedure, that they've got nothing to worry about. And so it really is a misinterpretation of the bill to think that in any way it's going to prevent them from doing their jobs.
Can I read another part? Because I just wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to this. So part of the op-ed also reads, we have already seen examples of this playing out in the United States. Legal uncertainties around reproductive health laws have led some physicians to delay or withhold urgent care out of fear of prosecution. This has led to preventable deaths and has caused a deadly erosion of access to reproductive care for women in the U.S. We cannot let this happen in Canada. What do you make of this American example?
I would say there is no comparison there. I can tell you right now that the majority of the Indigenous survivors that we have in the registry right now, they were just trying to have their babies. They were just having these routine procedures, and yet, these harms were forced upon them. And so, in terms of the hesitancy or what might be posed for the physician, they don't have anything to worry about if they're doing their job effectively.
One last paragraph from it. It was a pretty long op-ed. The SOGC also said this: we firmly believe decisions about reproductive health care do not belong in legislatures or courtrooms. They must remain a medical decision made between a woman and her clinician, using a blunt legislative instrument to address an acknowledged history of systemic racism and discrimination within the health system against Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized populations is not the answer. What is your response to this?
There may be systemic issues at play that obviously healthcare systems have not been built, are not culturally safe or Indigenous centered in the delivery of services. Systems have also upheld and protected physicians, not the patients. And so what the survivors are asking for here in their support of the bill is for the patient's rights to be protected in this instance. The testimonies that we have gathered and working and speaking with survivors is that it was very much a doctor's opinion, a doctor's choice, and a doctor's judgment that led to the sterilization. Mm-hmm. We see instances of nurses who have had no say in the matter and have supported whatever course of action was carried out by the physician, who have later gone back to the survivor and apologized for their participation, right? Witnesses to these acts that have happened that are very much the responsibility of one person.
Well, part of what the SOGC said is that forced sterilization is already against the law and assault laws already exist. Has any doctor in Canada been prosecuted for forced sterilization with the laws that we have?
At this point, no. So right now, what would have applied is the criminal code, under the criminal code would be aggravated assault. That's where it would fall right now. But it doesn't specifically name forced and coerced sterilization. And when we experience healthcare, we don't often look at it like crimes are being caused or that crime is occurring in a hospital situation in a healthcare scenario. So one of the common results or outcomes of a sterilization would be, what are my means? What can I do about this? And often what happens to the patient is they're directed to the hospital to file a complaint or a customer satisfaction survey, and often just kind of it gets put to the side, maybe gets addressed through a policy review by a committee, and often no action comes out of it. And so for many Indigenous people, where this has been an ongoing type of harm over decades, many Indigenous people have been silenced in that process of trying to seek any type of justice within a healthcare setting. And so it really has been a way for physicians to be protected, for physicians to not have to face the patient. And one of the great things that we have seen in recent years, but also we do still need to see a lot of work happening, is the apology and just the witnessing of this issue. We're just scratching the surface of what is yet to come out around forced and coerced sterilization in Canada. What we will see and what we have seen in recent years is the Canadian Medical Association did issue an apology on forced and coerced sterilization. And part of that meant that doctors had to face patients. And so it has really been about an accountability issue around power dynamics, around healthcare systems and settings where for many of the survivors, they need to be witnessed. They need to have their story heard. We are still very much in the truth phase of what's happened on the issue of forced and coerced sterilization. And we wouldn't need the bill if this wasn't still happening today.
So moving forward, when you look at life after the bill, we do see throughout this nation the denial of the horrors of residential schools and the continued harm of Indigenous peoples in the court and health systems. What could a law like this do for Indigenous people seeking justice for harms that they've experienced?
One of the outcomes of this work, again, may be to see that truth and reconciliation piece occur between the victims, the survivors of forced and coerced sterilization, as well as the physicians. So it is an important step. It is an important piece. And a lot of this has to do with being accountable and accountability, the justice that folks are seeking. In the future, what it could look like is a doctor will think twice before they make the racist statements or judgments or criticisms to a patient that they are working with, that they do take the time to actually have that conversation with the patient around what their options are and thoroughly explain what those options mean. It is a natural effort that you would think anybody would take just to make sure that the person understands, and that even after a procedure or even after the healthcare has been provided, that the relationship is ongoing and continues, right? That there is a aftercare plan, there is a follow-up, and that if somebody had chosen the course of action in that moment to decide differently, that's something, a relationship, dignity, respect, that is owed, right? That is something that hopefully with the passage of the bill, we will see better care, and especially for Indigenous people, Indigenous women experiencing the healthcare system, that they too will see and feel that difference.
It's been a long road to get to this moment. We've talked about trust throughout this conversation, but we've seen how this nation has treated Indigenous peoples. Do you trust that this bill will be passed, and if it is, that it will be upheld?
We do trust that the bill will be passed. The bill is meant to ensure that justice and accountability is in place going forward when healthcare is accessed by anybody when they are involved with the healthcare system where consent needs to be obtained. So it will pass, and the effect that we anticipate it will have, not just for the mainstream public, but for particularly for Indigenous communities, is that effort to have open, clear communication, that those measures of what is valid consent, informed consent, that those measures are actually in place. So if it means better training, if it means better consent forms and policy procedures in each province and each region, then those are the things that need to happen. And we do plan and anticipate that survivors are going to be involved in informing that every step of the way.
We started this conversation speaking about the Survivors Circle. What do you want people to know about the Survivors Circle?
The Survivor Circle for Reproductive Justice is made up of a membership of survivors who, like I said, are First Nation, Inuit, and Métis from every part of the country, every walk of life. They are young, they are middle-aged, they are older. And what I've learned, and I think what we've all learned from the work that they've done since the organization's been formed, is that they are incredibly powerful, important members of our community who do need to have their voice and do need to be able to teach us and show us the way and teach us about important issues such as this and how important our bodies are in making informed choices, and that how we even teach our children. Like, these are conversations that through many policies, including residential school, were just shut down. These conversations haven't happened around the family dinner table or in the family home or in a community setting for decades and decades and decades. So there is absolutely a movement of matriarchy, of Indigenous women and Indigenous people reclaiming the space to talk about bodily autonomy and to teach our children that. Just the power and the effort in their work there, I am so grateful to be a part of and to be able to support the work that's happening on that front.
Harmony, it's been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to add that I may have missed?
I would just add that you can find our website at reproductivejusticesurvivors.ca, and we do have social media accounts as well. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other places as well. We have lots of resources and lots of information available.
Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
This was Mistreated. Thanks for listening. You can follow our show wherever you download your podcasts so that you can get notified each time a new episode is available. We would love to hear your feedback. You can write me an email at mistreatedpodcast@tvo.org, or you can reach out to me on social media. This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb and me, edited by Colin Kish, digital shorts by Ariana Longley, camera work by Max Tussey, teleprompting by Christy McLeod. Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team. And Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. Stacey Duntis is the acting vice president, programming and content. Thanks so much for listening.